Well, I've been on a cruise ship a couple times in my life. And although the sea and I don't really get along that well given my motion sickness, actually the cruise experience wasn't all that bad. But suppose that I was on a cruise ship that had an accident at sea, and I was just fortunate enough to live through it. Do you think I'd get on another cruise ship? Oh, probably not. But suppose I figured, well, that must have just been bad luck, so I get on another ship. And wouldn't you know it, that ship experienced a serious accident too. But once again, I survived. You would think that would be the end of my cruising days. But even after 2 shipwrecks, I get on another one. And once again, it crashes. Well, after 3 shipwrecks, you would think I would be done with ships for good. Who on earth would board a ship after surviving 3 terrifying experiences at sea? Well, the Apostle Paul did. He had been in 3 shipwrecks when he found himself a prisoner on a ship headed to Rome. If it were me, I'd be pretty nervous about the voyage. And maybe Paul did have some nerves, having to get on yet another ship. But Paul also had faith in God. And the words of 1 Peter 5:7 come to mind. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Paul, no doubt, had some anxious times aboard yet another ship in trouble. And the storm he found himself was worse than any other he'd ever experienced. The experienced sailors tried everything they knew to control the ship, but were unsuccessful. And fearing the worst, they were white with fear and unable to eat. And yet, Paul found strength in the midst of the storm. Why? Because one of God's angels told Paul that he and everyone aboard would make it through the storm. Paul's ship would end up shipwrecked again, but nobody would perish. Paul found courage because he believed in God's word. His faith was bigger than his fear. And because of that, he was able to encourage others on board the doomed ship and give testimony concerning the power and faithfulness of his God. We see the story in Acts 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Paul's ship had been adrift now for 14 days, and they were being carried along the Adriatic Sea. This is not the modern Adriatic Sea that's located between Yugoslavia and Italy. Back then they called that the Gulf of Adria. What Luke meant by the Adriatic Sea is what is now known as the Ionian Sea, located between Greece and Italy. So Paul's ship has been blown 475 miles. The sailors sensed that they were approaching land. Now there's a rocky point on northeast Malta that's known as Cora Point. It's in this area that many people believe that Paul's ship crashed. And the waves crashing against the rocks at Cora Point can be heard for over a mile away. And it may have been this sound that got the sailors' attention that they were near land. So they took soundings to determine the water's depth, and soundings were made by throwing a rope with a lead weight into the water. When the weight hit the floor, they could tell how deep the water was by how much rope was extended. The first sounding indicated a water depth of 120 feet, and a short time later, a second sounding indicated the water was 90 feet. So they were obviously being driven into shallower water, and land was rapidly approaching. The fear of crashing into land and wrecking the ship resulted in 3 actions by the sailors. First, the sailors dropped 4 anchors. There's a museum in Italy that has on display a very rare artifact, a 1st century anchor like those used on grain ships from Alexandria. And the shape of the anchor looks somewhat like a pickaxe. The metal anchor is huge and heavy, about 8 feet long. An anchor would be inserted into a heavy wooden beam and lowered from the ship. The pointed ends would dig into the seafloor, slowing or stopping the ship. It would take special skill to accurately maneuver such a massive anchor. Ancient ships would carry several of these anchors. On Paul's ship, 4 anchors were dropped from the stern to slow it down and keep it from dashing into the rocks. Normally, ships dropped anchors from the bow, the front of the ship. But here, sailors dropped them from the stern, the back of the ship. By throwing the anchors off the stern, the ship would continue its forward progress toward the shore. It would provide a little bit of control instead of having the ship just wildly whip into the rocks. The second thing the sailors did was to pray for daylight and deliverance. They weren't praying to Paul's God. They were praying to their pagan gods. But the answer would not come from their pagan gods, but from Paul's God. They prayed for daylight because they were helpless in the darkness. They had to have some visibility for their skills to have any effect at all. So they were praying that they would make it through the night in order to have a chance of survival in the morning. Well, the sailors tried to escape. Evidently, these sailors didn't trust their own gods and decided to take matters into their own hands. So they pretended to be lowering an anchor, when in reality, they were preparing the lifeboat in order to abandon the ship. This was a selfish and cowardly act, and Paul interrupted their escape attempt. Paul wasn't fooled. He knew what was going on. This wasn't his first voyage. And he knew that keeping these sailors on the ship was crucial for a safe landing. I mean, just imagine that you were on a plane flying across the country, and halfway to your destination, as the plane was cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet, the plane started suffering mechanical problems. And the crew struggled with the plane, trying to stabilize it in preparation for a crash landing at a nearby airport. But when the plane had descended to 13,000 feet, suddenly, the flight crew quickly dons parachutes and prepares to jump off the plane. Well, that's not good, right? Because the flight crew is your only chance to survive a crash landing. You need their skill to stay alive. And that was the situation that Paul was in. These sailors who were trying to escape were weasels, but they were also skilled. And their skill was needed to put the ship in the best position for a crash landing. If the sailors escaped, the chance of the rest of them surviving the crash would be pretty dim. So Paul reported to the centurion and the soldiers what was going on. And the soldiers quickly stopped the escape attempt, and to make sure it didn't happen again, they cut the rope of the lifeboat. Now, the sailors had no choice but to remain on the ship and use their nautical skills to land it safely. We pick it up in verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So just before dawn, Paul announced, "It's time for breakfast." And it wasn't just that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. It was that this particular breakfast could be the most important meal of their lives. In a short time, the rescue attempt would begin. But to have the strength to pull it off, they needed some nourishment. It had been a couple weeks since they ate a proper meal. And their lack of food was due to several realities, fear, forced rationing, fasting, seasickness, and preoccupation with just surviving the storm. But now, they had to eat some food in order to survive. They needed some energy for what lay ahead. By eating food, they were demonstrating hope. If they knew they would certainly die, then why eat? But by eating, they recognized that they might just make it through this ordeal. But Paul wanted to kick their hope to a higher level. They ate because they thought they might make it. Paul said, "Not one of you will lose a single hair on your head." Well, that's Old Testament talk. That basically means you're going to come through this perfectly fine and totally unharmed. Paul didn't think they might make it. He knew for sure they would make it. The Lord told him so. Then Paul took some bread and gave thanks. I'm sure he thanked God for the food and also for the certain rescue. He wanted all aboard that ship to know that his God was in control. His God and only his God provided for their salvation. So those who were aboard the ship were encouraged and they ate. There was no food rationing at this point. They ate as much as they wanted. This wasn't a time just to nibble. This was a time to eat heartily and gain some energy. Once they were finished with breakfast, they threw some grain overboard to lighten the ship. Obviously, by getting rid of some of the cargo, the boat would weigh less. The lighter the ship, the higher in the water it would sit, and the closer it could get to shore before running aground. This would make it easier for everyone to get to land safely. Now we pick it up in verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The traditional site for Paul's shipwreck is known today as St. Paul's Bay. The main port of Malta is further to the west, and St. Paul's Bay would not likely have been familiar to the ancient seamen. So they didn't know where they were. However, they saw a bay with a sandy beach. Perfect. A nice, soft, sandy place to bring in the ship. If they saw a rocky set of cliffs at daybreak, they'd been quite discouraged. They knew that a ship would just break apart on the rocky cliffs, but a sandy beach gave them hope of success. Well, the sailors maneuvered the ship to head for the beach. First, they cut loose the anchors, and this would take the brakes off the ship and allow it to head to the beach. Next, they untied the ropes that held the rudders. The rudders of ancient ships consisted of like large paddles. In a storm, these would be lifted from the water and tied down. But now, they needed to steer. So the rudders were let back down into the water so they could guide the ship in. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind. And the foresail was a small sail in the bow of the ship that was primarily used for guiding it. The goal was to get to the beach as quickly as possible. So with the anchors cut, the rudders down, and the foresail up, the ship was on its way. However, the ship hit a sandbar, so near and yet so far. The ship didn't make it to the beach as they had planned. The bow of the ship stuck fast into the sandbar. The ship could not move forward. But the pounding of the waves from behind the ship caused the stern to be destroyed. So at this point, they all had no choice but to abandon ship and get to shore the best they could. Verse 42. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners. Now on the surface, this seems kind of heartless. Why kill them at this point? Well, it's because the soldiers are responsible for the prisoners. If the prisoners were allowed to escape, the soldiers would be punished. They could pay with their own lives. But the centurion Julius stopped the soldiers from killing the prisoners. Luke tells us that Julius wanted to spare Paul's life. But if he only spared Paul's life, he'd have to then explain why only Paul was allowed to live while the others were killed. So the centurion didn't allow any of the prisoners to be killed by the soldiers. With the lifeboat already gone, those aboard the ship had to swim to the shore. But the problem was that not everyone could swim. So those who could swim did. Those who could not swim grabbed onto a piece of the ship that was floating in the water and paddled to the shore boogie board style. So here's the deal. You got 276 people aboard the ship. You have the ship wrecked to pieces several hundred yards from the shore. You have some that are unable to swim. You have no lifeboat available. So what are the chances that everyone will make it safely to shore? Pretty slim. In fact, if everyone did make it, some might call that a miracle. And it might just have been. Because humanly speaking, not everyone aboard that ship should have survived. But God promised Paul that none would perish, and none did. God was faithful to his word. And that really is a takeaway to this story, God's faithfulness. We see that over and over again in the stories of Paul's journeys, that God is faithful. And here God promised Paul that nobody would perish in the shipwreck, and nobody did. God was true to his word, end of story. And we could focus on the faith and courage of Paul, but that really does miss the point. Paul certainly would not take any credit for the saving of the 276 on the doomed ship. Sure, he stopped the sailors from escaping in the lifeboat. And yes, he did the practical thing in getting those aboard to eat. And yes, he encouraged them by telling them that nobody would be harmed in the ordeal. But perhaps the most significant thing he did was at breakfast time, when he took bread and gave thanks in front of them all. He showed confidence in his God. Right before it all hit the fan, he reminded them that their amazing deliverance would be from the hands of his amazing God. He was so confident that he thanked God in advance. God is faithful. He doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep. And he has the power to fulfill any promise he makes. He's always true to his word, and we can count on him.